They had no idea who they were dealing with. When a flight attendant ordered a black family to leave first class, it seemed like just another act of bias. But moments later, the truth was revealed. This family wasn't just wealthy, they owned the entire airline. And what happened next changed everything. Welcome to Soul Deep Stories. If you enjoy thought-provoking stories like this, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. We are all here by divine alignment, drawn together by the same frequency, the same thoughts. I hope today's story brings you a powerful emotional experience. Now let's begin. The boarding gate buzzed with activity as passengers hurried to find their seats. Among them, a family of 3 stepped in with a quiet sense of confidence. Marcus Whitmore, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, carried a sleek leather briefcase. His presence exuded power and composure. Beside him Elise, his stunning wife, with flowing black hair, radiant eyes and warm brown skin that only enhanced her striking beauty, walked with effortless grace. She wore an elegant ivory dress, holding the tiny hand of their young son, Noah, who skipped excitedly at her side. This was a trip they had long awaited, a rare chance to escape their demanding lives and unwind. As they stepped into the first-class cabin, the warm glow of the cabin lights reflected off polished surfaces, adding to the air of luxury. Marcus glanced at the seat numbers and gave a slight smile. "Here we are, love. Come on," he said, guiding Elise and Noah to their seats. Nearby passengers acknowledged them with polite nods. Elise helped Noah climb into his seat, handing him a small toy airplane that instantly lit up his face with joy, while Marcus stored their carry-on luggage in the overhead compartment. A few feet away, a flight attendant named Sophia Caldwell, a blonde-haired, fair-skinned woman with striking features, observed the family with a sharp, scrutinizing gaze. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and a flicker of something unreadable crossed her face. Straightening her crisp uniform, she took a steady breath before striding briskly toward them. Her smile was forced, barely concealing the judgment behind her eyes. "Excuse me," Sophia said, her tone carrying a firm authority as she addressed Marcus. "May I see your boarding passes?" Marcus turned to her calmly, reaching into his jacket pocket and retrieving the tickets. "Of course," he replied, nodding politely as he handed them over. Elise looked up, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Meanwhile, Noah remained blissfully unaware, happily playing with his toy airplane, as tension quietly settled in the air around them. Noah continued playing with his toy airplane, oblivious to the growing unease. Meanwhile, Sophia examined the boarding passes with an exaggerated level of scrutiny. Her brows furrowed as she double-checked the details, her lips tightening slightly. "First class?" she murmured as if the words tasted foreign on her tongue. Marcus remained composed, nodding once. "Yes, these are our seats. I booked them weeks ago," he replied evenly. His tone was measured, but Elise, seated beside him, noticed the slight tension in his jawline. Sophia hesitated, her discomfort palpable. "I'm sorry, but I need to verify something with the front desk. Please remain seated, there may have been some kind of mix-up." Her voice was clipped, controlled. Before Marcus could respond, she spun on her heel and walked away, her steps brisk and deliberate. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his face unreadable. Elise turned to him, her voice soft but tinged with concern. "What was that about?" "Probably just a routine check," Marcus said, placing a reassuring hand over hers. But despite his calm words, the slight tightening around his mouth betrayed his true feelings. Behind the curtain, Sophia hurried into the galley, snatching up the intercom phone with a sense of urgency. Keeping her voice low, she spoke quickly. "I have a situation here," she muttered, glancing toward the first-class cabin as if making sure no one could hear. "There's a family in first class and I'm not sure their tickets are valid. Can you confirm their booking?" A brief silence followed before the ground staff's puzzled response crackled through the receiver. "The Whitmores? Their tickets were purchased weeks ago. Fully confirmed. Is there an issue?" Sophia paused, gripping the phone a little tighter. For a moment, something unreadable flickered across her face. Disbelief, irritation, or perhaps something deeper. No issue," she muttered, cutting the call abruptly. But instead of returning with an apology, her expression hardened. Squaring her shoulders, she adjusted her uniform, inhaled sharply, and strode back toward first class, determination replacing hesitation. When she reached their seats again, her voice carried a sharper edge. "I'm sorry, but I need you to step aside for a moment. There seems to be an error with your booking." Elise's brows knitted together as she exchanged a glance with Marcus. Beside her, Noah looked up from his toy, sensing the change in atmosphere. Marcus rose to his feet slowly, his movements measured, his calm exterior masking the frustration brewing beneath. His gaze locked onto Sophia's with quiet intensity. "What kind of error?" he asked, his voice steady. Sophia avoided his gaze, her posture stiff. "I need to confirm your seating," she said, motioning toward the galley. Marcus hesitated for a brief moment before nodding. He turned slightly toward Elise, giving her a reassuring look. "Stay here with Noah," he murmured, his tone calm but firm. Then, with measured steps, he followed Sophia toward the galley. A ripple of whispers spread through the cabin as passengers exchanged curious glances. Something was off and they could feel it. Elise sat stiffly in her seat, her unease growing with each passing second. Noah, sensing the change in atmosphere, tugged gently at her sleeve. His voice was small, uncertain. "Mommy, what's happening?" Elise forced a soft smile, though her grip on his tiny hand instinctively tightened. "Nothing, sweetheart," she said gently. "Daddy's just sorting something out." But in her heart, she knew this was far from routine. Something wasn't right, and a deep instinct told her this situation was about to escalate. Meanwhile, in the galley, Marcus stood with unwavering composure as Sophia fidgeted, her usual air of authority now laced with hesitation. "Sir," she began, her voice carrying a strained mix of professionalism and unease. "We're just trying to clarify a seating issue. It appears that your reservation may have been flagged." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable but sharp. "Flagged?" he echoed, his voice even but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I booked these tickets weeks ago. Paid in full. Confirmed. What exactly is the issue?" Sophia squared her shoulders, adopting a more defensive stance. "It's not about payment," she said, her words careful, measured. "First class is a premium cabin, and we have to ensure all seating is accurate." A flicker of something, disbelief, amusement, irritation, crossed Marcus's face. His lips curved slightly, but there was no humor in his expression. "Premium cabin," he repeated slowly. "Are you implying that I don't belong here?" Realizing too late how her words had sounded. "Of course not," she replied quickly, her voice sharpening as if to cover her discomfort. "I just need to follow protocol." Marcus inhaled deeply, his controlled exterior betraying only the slightest hint of frustration. His voice, when he spoke again, was steady but carried a quiet authority that was impossible to ignore. "Very well," he said. "Let's resolve this quickly. My family is waiting." Back in the cabin, passengers murmured in hushed tones, their curiosity growing with every passing second. Elise felt the weight of their stares but kept her focus on Noah, who now fidgeted with his toy airplane, his earlier excitement dimmed by the change in mood. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man leaned slightly toward her, concern etched on his face. His voice was low, careful. "Is everything okay?" Elise turned to him, offering a tight but polite smile. "It's just a mix-up," she said, though even she didn't believe her own words. Elise's words did little to reassure the man across the aisle. He nodded but cast a glance toward the galley, where Marcus had disappeared moments ago. His instincts told him there was more to this situation than just a mix-up. Meanwhile, in the galley, Sophia stepped away from Marcus, her expression tense as she turned to another flight attendant. Natalie, a younger woman who had been quietly observing from the side. Sensing the unease in Sophia's posture, Natalie furrowed her brows. "Did you check the reservation system?" she asked cautiously, stealing a glance toward Marcus, who stood waiting with an air of unwavering patience. Sophia exhaled sharply. "Yes, but it's not just about the ticket," she whispered, leaning in slightly. She flicked her eyes toward Marcus, her voice low but laced with something unspoken. "Look at him. Does he seem like the usual first-class passenger?" Natalie's eyes widened slightly, her expression shifting from concern to disbelief. "You can't make those kinds of judgments," she said firmly, lowering her voice further. "If his ticket is valid, that's the end of it." Sophia huffed, clearly unsettled by Natalie's disapproval, but she squared her shoulders and strode back toward Marcus. "Sir," she said, her tone clipped, masking the unease creeping into her voice. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you and your family to move to the main cabin until we sort this out." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. His voice, however, carried a quiet authority that made Sophia hesitate. "On what grounds?" he asked. Sophia stiffened. "Like I said, it's protocol." She avoided his gaze, her professional mask slipping ever so slightly. Marcus's patience, though vast, had its limits. His voice dropped to a lower register, calm but edged with steel. If you're suggesting we leave first class, I expect a clear and valid reason. Because right now, it seems like you're acting on something other than protocol. Sophia opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a chime echoed through the cabin. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm yet commanding. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as we finalize some adjustments. We will ensure your comfort for the remainder of the flight. The announcement barely registered in Sophia's mind. She felt her composure slipping as Marcus gave her a long, measured look. Then, without another word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone and stepped slightly away. "Excuse me," he said curtly, his tone still polite but now carrying a distinct air of finality. He pressed a number and held the phone to his ear. His voice, though quiet, carried unmistakable authority. "Is this still the right time?" he asked. There was a brief pause before he nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. "Good. Proceed as planned." He ended the call swiftly, slipping his phone back into his pocket before turning his attention back to Sophia. The tension in the air thickened as she swallowed hard, suddenly aware that she might have gravely miscalculated the situation. Marcus slipped his phone back into his pocket and turned to Sophia, his expression calm but unreadable. "Shall we return to my family?" he asked, his tone polite yet firm. Sophia hesitated. The unwavering confidence in his voice sent a ripple of unease through her. Nodding stiffly, she gestured for him to follow her back to the first-class cabin. As they walked, a hush fell over the passengers. Eyes discreetly followed their movements, and quiet murmurs filled the air. It was clear that others had sensed the tension, even if they didn't yet understand its cause. Elise stood as soon as she saw Marcus returning, her questioning gaze searching his. He gave her a small, reassuring nod, but she caught the subtle shift in his expression, one only she would notice. A silent message passed between them. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Sophia, still visibly unsettled, led Marcus back to his seat. Elise met him with a quiet, searching look, and he responded by gently squeezing her hand. Noah, sensing his father's return, beamed and happily resumed playing with his toy airplane, blissfully unaware of the tension crackling around him. But before Marcus could even settle into his seat, Sophia returned, her posture rigid, her face set with forced determination. "Sir," she began, her voice clipped as if rehearsed. "We've decided that it would be best for you and your family to move to the main cabin until we can fully verify your reservation." Elise's jaw tightened, though she remained composed, her sharp gaze flicking toward Marcus. Marcus inhaled deeply, slow and deliberate, before turning to face Sophia fully. His voice, when he spoke, was still calm, but now carried a weight that made the air around them feel heavier. "Our tickets have already been verified," he said evenly. "We paid for these seats in full. If there is a valid reason for us to move, I would like to hear it." "Now." Sophia hesitated, her confidence wavering under the intensity of his gaze. Around them, the low hum of whispers swelled. Passengers shifted in their seats, watching the exchange unfold. An elderly woman a few rows away leaned toward her companion and murmured, "They've been perfectly polite. What's the issue?" A younger man nearby, unable to contain his frustration, spoke loud enough for others to hear. "They're paying customers like the rest of us. Why are they being singled out?" The murmurs grew into a chorus of discontent, passengers exchanging questioning glances, their concern deepening. Sophia's fingers twitched slightly as she straightened her posture. The weight of the scrutiny from all directions seemed to rattle her. "Sir, I don't want to escalate this," she said, her voice sharpening. "Please cooperate or I'll be forced to involve security." Elise's eyes narrowed, a quiet fire flickering behind them. Marcus, however, remained still, his expression unchanged, unshaken, unwavering. The air inside the cabin had shifted. What had begun as a quiet inquiry had now turned into something much bigger. And Sophia was beginning to realize that she was losing control of it. Elise's patience was wearing thin, but before she could say a word, Marcus raised a hand subtly, signaling her to remain calm. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he stood, adjusting his suit jacket with precise care. "If you're calling security," he said evenly, his voice carrying through the cabin, "make sure they come prepared with an explanation." Sophia's face reddened slightly, a wave of tension rippled but she held her ground, though her voice betrayed a hint of desperation now. "Please gather your belongings," she insisted. Marcus locked eyes with her for a long moment, the intensity in his gaze making her shift uncomfortably. Then he turned to Elise. "It's fine," he said softly, his demeanor as steady as ever. "Let's go." A hush fell over the cabin as the Whitmore family slowly rose. Noah clutched his toy airplane, his excitement now replaced by confusion. Elise held his hand firmly, keeping her posture poised and unreadable as she followed Marcus down the aisle. All eyes were on them as they made their way toward the main cabin. Murmurs swirled behind them, but neither Marcus nor Elise reacted. Marcus reached into his pocket and typed a quick message on his phone, his face betraying nothing. They were led to a row of cramped seats in the middle of the main cabin. The contrast between the open luxury of first class and the confined space here was stark, but neither Marcus nor Elise outwardly reacted. Marcus helped Elise settle Noah into his seat before taking his own, his movements as composed as ever. Meanwhile, back in the galley, Sophia's nerves were fraying. She could hear the rising discontent from first-class passengers. "That wasn't right," a man muttered. "They had tickets," another voice chimed in. "Why treat them like that?" "This is going to backfire," someone else added. Sophia clenched her jaw, ignoring the voices, but the weight of their words pressed down on her. Her discomfort grew as she reached for the galley phone, only to jump slightly when it buzzed before she could even lift the receiver. Hesitating, she picked it up, her voice shaky. "This is Sophia," she answered. The captain's voice came through, firm and no nonsense. "Miss Caldwell, I just received a call from the airline's executive team. A passenger on this flight contacted them directly. I need to know exactly what's going on." Sophia's stomach dropped. Her grip tightened on the phone as she struggled to find her words. Sophia's grip on the phone tightened, her confidence evaporating. It was just a routine issue," she stammered, her voice unsteady. "I thought there might have been a mistake with their tickets." There was a long pause on the other end. When the captain finally spoke again, his voice was laced with warning. "You need to handle this carefully. We cannot afford a situation like this," he said, his tone measured but firm. "I suggest you tread lightly until further notice." The line went dead. Sophia hung up the phone, her palms slick with sweat. She turned toward the main cabin, her gaze instinctively landing on Marcus. He sat upright, composed, his expression unreadable yet commanding. Elise sat beside him, her posture just as poised, though her sharp glances toward the first-class cabin betrayed a simmering frustration. Noah remained blissfully unaware, idly running his fingers along the wings of his toy airplane, but Elise's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, a subtle, protective gesture. Marcus, however, seemed unbothered. With a calculated ease, he pulled out his phone, typed a brief message, then leaned back, his expression giving away nothing as he observed the situation unfolding around him. Back in first class, the murmurs of discontent among the passengers had grown louder. A tall man in a tailored suit leaned slightly toward Sophia as she walked past. "That family had valid tickets," he said, his tone edged with criticism. "What exactly was the problem?" Sophia tried to keep her voice steady, though her nerves were beginning to fray. "It's just a procedural matter," she replied curtly. "Everything's under control." The man frowned but didn't press further, though the disapproval in his gaze was unmistakable. Hurriedly, Sophia retreated to the galley, her mind racing. But as soon as she stepped inside, she was met with the disapproving stare of Natalie, who was stacking a tray of refreshments. Without a word, Natalie handed her a drink order, but her posture was stiff, her silence heavy with judgment. "You need to fix this," Natalie finally said in a low, firm voice. "That man isn't just any passenger. He's been calm, but I can tell, he's not letting this slide." Sophia bristled, crossing her arms defensively. "I was just following protocol," she snapped. "It's not my fault if people can't handle being questioned." Natalie set the tray down harder than necessary, her patience visibly thinning. "Protocol doesn't mean you single people out based on how they look," she said flatly. For the first time, Sophia had no immediate response. The weight of the situation was beginning to sink in, and for the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into her mind. Natalie's words hung heavy in the air. Sophia opened her mouth to retort but was interrupted by the sudden buzz of the galley phone. Her stomach twisted as she hesitated before picking it up. This time, the voice on the other end wasn't the captain's, it was from the airline's executive office. "Miss Caldwell," a calm but firm voice said, "we've received a direct complaint from a passenger on your flight. It concerns the handling of a seating issue in first class." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "I was just following." "Save your explanations," the voice cut in sharply. "You removed a family with fully confirmed first-class tickets. The passenger in question is Marcus Whitmore. I suggest you look up his name in the system immediately." Sophia's hand trembled as she ended the call. A sinking feeling settled in her chest as she turned toward the service computer. Her fingers fumbled over the keyboard as she typed in the name, Marcus Whitmore. The profile loaded and her breath hitched. Beside his name, a designation stood out starkly, executive-level primary shareholder. Sophia's mouth went dry. This wasn't just any passenger. Marcus Whitmore wasn't simply wealthy, he was one of the airline's owners. Back in the main cabin, Marcus sat with the same composed air, his posture unwavering. Elise sat beside him, her expression calm but sharp, her fingers lightly tracing patterns on Noah's back as he continued playing with his toy airplane. When Sophia emerged from the galley, her usual air of authority was gone. Her face was pale, her steps uncertain. She hesitated for a brief moment before making her way toward their row. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, her voice lower than before, carrying none of its earlier sharpness. "I'd like to apologize for the inconvenience. It seems, there was an error on my part." Marcus turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting hers. His expression remained calm, unreadable. "An error," he repeated, his tone neutral. "You removed my family from first class based on what, exactly?" Sophia swallowed hard, her voice faltering. I made a mistake in verifying your reservation," she admitted. "I assure you it won't happen again." Elise's composure cracked for the first time, her usually controlled expression hardening into something sharper. "You humiliated my family in front of an entire cabin," she said, her voice measured but laced with quiet fury. "You made assumptions about us without any justification. Do you really think an apology is enough?" Noah looked up at his mother, sensing the shift in her tone. He fidgeted slightly, uncomfortable with the tension in the air. Marcus placed a calming hand on Elise's arm. "Elise," he said softly, his voice steady. "Let's not." Marcus's gaze remained unwavering as he spoke. "I'll handle this matter directly with your superiors," he said, his tone controlled but firm. "For now we'll remain where we are." Sophia swallowed hard and gave a stiff nod, unsure how to respond. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and retreated toward the galley, her steps quicker, more unsteady than before. The weight of her mistake was settling in, but she still didn't fully grasp how far-reaching the consequences would be. Back in his seat, Marcus leaned back, exuding an air of effortless composure. A faint, knowing smile ghosted across his lips. He had made his move. Now it was only a matter of time. Sophia reached the galley and immediately gripped the counter, her hands trembling. The realization of who Marcus Whitmore truly was left her reeling. Her mind raced, replaying every single interaction she had with him and his family, each one now standing as undeniable proof of her misjudgment. She glanced up nervously and met Natalie's gaze. The younger flight attendant stood with her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of disappointment and quiet pity. "Did you know?" Sophia whispered, her voice barely steady. Natalie sighed, shaking her head. "No," she admitted. "But it doesn't matter. You treated them unfairly, and now it looks like you're going to answer for it." Sophia's stomach twisted into knots. Before she could respond, the galley phone buzzed again. The sound made her jump. Her fingers hovered over the receiver for a brief moment before she forced herself to pick it up. The captain's voice came through, clipped and tense. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I've just received another call from the executive office. Mr. Whitmore's identity has been confirmed, and they are not happy." Sophia felt the blood drain from her face. "The instructions are clear," the captain continued. "He and his family are to be reinstated in first class immediately. And you," he paused for a beat as if to let the words sink in. "You are to personally deliver an apology." Sophia's grip on the phone tightened. "Understood," she managed to whisper. The line went dead. Leaning against the counter, she struggled to steady her breathing. The walls of control she had built around herself were crumbling, and she knew there was no undoing what had already been done. Across from her, Natalie didn't look away. "You brought this on yourself," she said quietly. "Do the right thing before it gets worse." Sophia swallowed, forcing down the lump in her throat. Summoning what little courage she had left, she adjusted her uniform, straightened her posture, and turned toward the main cabin. Every step felt heavier than the last. The weight of her mistake pressed down on her. And this time there was no escaping it. Sophia approached the Whitmore family, each step heavier than the last. The murmurs in the cabin had died down, but the weight of countless eyes watching her made it impossible to ignore the scrutiny. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, her voice softer than anyone had heard it before. "On behalf of the airline, I'd like to sincerely apologize for the inconvenience and the way your family has been treated. It was an error in judgment and I take full responsibility. Elise raised an eyebrow, her expression a mixture of restrained anger and disbelief. Now you realize it was an error? She asked, her voice cool and controlled. Sophia's face flushed, but she kept her tone professional. The executive office has instructed that your family be returned to first class immediately, she said. I will personally ensure that your seats are ready and that there are no further disruptions. Marcus studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a small nod, he stood and gestured for Elise and Noah to follow. Elise held Noah's hand tightly as they walked past Sophia, her back straight, her gaze forward. Noah, still blissfully unaware of the gravity of the situation, clutched his toy airplane, skipping slightly beside his mother. When they reached first class, Sophia busied herself preparing their seats, ensuring every detail was perfect. She placed sparkling water on the tray tables, adjusted the pillows with trembling hands, and stepped aside as the family settled in. Their demeanor was calm but distant. Sophia hesitated before speaking again. If there's anything else you need, please let me know. Marcus gave a slight nod, his tone polite but firm. We'll let you know. With that, Sophia retreated back to the galley. Her face was pale, her nerves frayed. She had followed the captain's orders, but she knew the damage was already done. The first-class cabin had grown quiet again, but the disapproving glances lingered. The passengers didn't forget. In the galley, Natalie stood with her arms crossed, watching as Sophia returned. It's not over, she said quietly. You know that, right? Sophia didn't respond. She knew Natalie was right. Marcus Whitmore's composure wasn't one of forgiveness. It was the calm of a man who had already set the wheels of accountability in motion. And for the first time, Sophia understood just how far the repercussions of her actions would reach. Marcus's actions were only just beginning. As the flight settled back into a semblance of normalcy, Sophia tried to focus on her remaining duties, but her mind was clouded with anxiety. Every glance from the passengers felt like a silent judgment, a reminder of the mistake she had made. She stole a glance toward the first-class cabin, where Marcus and his family sat. They appeared calm, composed, but their presence weighed heavily on her in a way she couldn't quite explain. Marcus, however, was far from passive. Sitting upright, he tapped methodically on his phone, each movement deliberate and intentional. Beside him, Elise leaned back in her seat, her expression unreadable, while Noah happily sipped juice from a small carton. The serene picture they painted only made the tension in the cabin more palpable. And Sophia wasn't the only one feeling it. Natalie, quietly observing, had overheard murmurs from the first-class passengers. Do you think they'll file a formal complaint? A man whispered to his companion. If it were me, I'd take it straight to the top, another passenger replied. In the galley, the phone buzzed once again. Sophia froze. The sound had become synonymous with dread. She hesitated before picking it up, her voice shaking. This is Sophia. This time, the captain's voice was sharper. Miss Caldwell, I just received another update from the executive office. Mr. Whitmore's legal team is monitoring the situation closely. They've requested a full account of events and will be waiting upon landing. I suggest you prepare yourself. Sophia's grip tightened on the receiver, her palms slick with sweat. Yes, Captain, she replied weakly before hanging up. The message was clear. Marcus Whitmore had no intention of letting this fade into the background. Back in first class, Marcus finished typing his final message and set his phone down. Elise glanced at him, her expression softening. You've been quiet, she said gently, her voice filled with understanding. Marcus turned to her, his expression calm yet resolute. This isn't just about us, he said. This is about accountability. People like her need to understand that actions have consequences. Elise nodded, her gaze steady, her determination mirroring his. She knew her husband's approach, measured, deliberate, but effective. It was what had propelled him to where he was today. And this time she was certain that Sophia Caldwell would soon realize it too. Marcus Whitmore was a man of influence, one who never tolerated injustice no matter how small. Meanwhile, in the galley, Sophia paced back and forth, her nerves unraveling with each passing moment. Natalie approached cautiously. What's the plan now? She asked. Sophia shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. I never thought something like this would spiral so far. Natalie's expression hardened. You should have thought about that before treating them the way you did, she said bluntly. Now it's out of your hands. Sophia shot her a glare but said nothing. As much as she wanted to deny it, the truth of Natalie's words cut deeper than she was willing to admit. The remainder of the flight dragged on. The steady hum of the engines did little to mask the underlying tension. In first class, passengers occasionally stole glances at the Whitmore family. Some looked on with curiosity, others with quiet respect. A few pretended not to notice at all, but the hushed whispers proved otherwise. Then the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, will be landing shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and your tray tables are in their upright positions. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Marcus adjusted his seat and leaned slightly toward Elise. "This will be over soon," he murmured. She offered him a small but supportive smile, briefly resting her hand on his. Back in the galley, Sophia stared at the clock, her chest tightening with every passing second. She knew the landing would bring no relief, only more questions, more judgment, and likely more consequences. Natalie's words echoed in her mind. "It's not over." And deep down, Sophia knew, the worst was yet to come. The plane touched down smoothly, the familiar jolt signaling the end of the flight. For most passengers, it was the start of a routine disembarkation. For Sophia, it felt like the beginning of her reckoning. She stood stiffly near the galley, gripping the counter as passengers began collecting their belongings. Her eyes flicked toward first class, where Marcus Whitmore remained seated, calm and unhurried. Elise leaned toward him as Noah sat quietly, swinging his legs. "What's the plan?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible over the rustling of passengers preparing to leave. Marcus's expression remained unchanged. "We wait," he said simply. "Everything is already in motion." As first-class passengers began filing out, many cast curious glances at the Whitmore family. Some hesitated, debating whether to say something, while others merely observed in silence. One man finally stopped beside Marcus's seat. He hesitated before speaking, his voice low but sincere. "I'm sorry for what happened earlier," he said. "It wasn't right." Marcus looked up at him, his expression measured. He gave a small nod. "Thank you," he replied. The man returned the nod before continuing toward the exit, his expression thoughtful. At the front of the plane, Sophia stood by the main door, forcing a smile at departing passengers. Each polite nod and murmured farewell felt heavier than the last. No matter how hard she tried to maintain her composure, she couldn't stop herself from glancing back at first class, where Marcus and his family remained seated. Their refusal to move with the rest of the passengers made her stomach churn. Then the galley phone buzzed. Sophia jumped, startled, before grabbing it quickly. Her voice cracked as she answered. "This is Sophia." It was the captain again. His tone was clipped, businesslike. "Security will be waiting at the gate," he informed her. "They've been briefed by the executive team. You are to stay on board and provide a full account of your actions. Do not leave the plane until instructed." Sophia's heart sank. "Understood," she whispered, barely able to get the words out before hanging up. Natalie approached, her expression grim. "They're here, aren't they?" she asked. Sophia nodded numbly. "Security. The executives. Probably the board." Natalie sighed, shaking her head. "I told you this wasn't over." As the last few passengers exited, the cabin grew eerily quiet. Sophia turned just in time to see Marcus rise from his seat. He smoothed his jacket before helping Elise gather their belongings. Noah clutched his toy airplane tightly, looking up at his parents with innocent curiosity. Sophia took an uncertain step forward, her voice unsteady. "Mr. Whitmore, I want to apologize again for—" Marcus raised a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. His tone was calm but final. "Save it," he said. "The people waiting outside will hear everything you have to say." Elise shot Sophia a cold glance as she took Noah's hand and stepped into the aisle. Without another word, Marcus followed. And Sophia knew, her reckoning had only just begun. Marcus's presence commanded attention without effort. As the Whitmore family approached the plane's exit, 2 uniformed security officers stepped aboard. They exchanged brief nods with Marcus before their eyes settled on Sophia. "Miss Caldwell?" one officer asked, his tone firm. Sophia's throat tightened. "Yes," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll need you to remain on the plane for questioning," the officer said. "Please follow us to the galley." At the door, Marcus paused briefly. He turned back, his gaze resting on Sophia. His expression remained calm, but the sharpness in his eyes sent a chill through her. Without another word, he stepped off the plane, Elise and Noah following closely behind. As their figures disappeared into the terminal, Sophia felt the full weight of her actions pressing down on her. The officers gestured for her to move toward the galley. She obeyed, her legs trembling beneath her. The realization struck her with brutal clarity: her future was no longer in her hands. The moment the Whitmore family entered the terminal, the atmosphere around them shifted. The usual bustle of passengers was interrupted by the sight of two airline executives waiting nearby. Dressed in tailored suits, they stood stiffly, their professional demeanor barely masking their nervous energy. One of them, a tall man with silver-rimmed glasses, stepped forward to greet Marcus. "Mr. Whitmore," the man began, his tone apologetic yet formal. "I'm Richard Hale, Vice President of Operations. On behalf of the airline, I want to extend our deepest apologies for the unacceptable treatment you and your family experienced today. We are taking this matter very seriously." Marcus gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. Elise stood beside him, holding Noah's hand, her posture as composed as ever. "I trust you are," Marcus replied, his tone calm but unmistakably cutting. "Because this isn't just about us. It's about the standards your airline claims to uphold, and how they failed today." Richard swallowed visibly, adjusting his tie. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Whitmore," he said carefully. "We are already initiating a thorough review of our policies and training programs to ensure that nothing like this happens again. I assure you accountability will be taken." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Accountability," he repeated. "That's exactly what I expect. But I also expect tangible changes, not just promises. Words won't repair the damage caused by actions or assumptions." Richard nodded quickly. "We've already begun reviewing the incident. The flight attendant involved will be questioned and held responsible for her actions. If you have time, the CEO himself would like to meet with you to discuss this further." Marcus glanced at Elise, who met his gaze with a subtle but firm nod of agreement. "Schedule the meeting," Marcus said. "I'll make time." As the Whitmore family walked toward baggage claim, the executives remained behind, exchanging uneasy glances. Back on the plane, Sophia sat in the galley, flanked by two security officers. Her hands trembled slightly as she stared at the table in front of her. The air felt stifling, the silence oppressive. Finally, one of the officers broke it. "Miss Caldwell, we're going to need a detailed statement about the events on this flight. The airline's executive team is already reviewing the complaint filed by Mr. Whitmore." Sophia's eyes darted between the two men. I didn't know who he was," she stammered. I thought there was an issue with their tickets." One of the officers frowned, his gaze steady. "Miss Caldwell, the issue wasn't with their tickets. The issue was with your actions. What made you decide to remove a family with confirmed first-class reservations?" Sophia hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as she scrambled for the right words. When she finally spoke, her voice was weak, defensive. "I was following protocol," she said. "I thought they might have been in the wrong section. First class it's premium seating and they—" She stopped herself, realizing too late how her words sounded. The officer's expression hardened. "And they what, Miss Caldwell? Didn't look the part?" Sophia's face flushed. "No, I didn't mean that. I made a mistake. I didn't intend for this to happen." The second officer leaned forward, his voice sharper. "Intentions don't matter here, Miss Caldwell. What matters are your actions. And actions have consequences. Do you understand that?" Sophia swallowed hard. For the first time she truly did. Sophia nodded quickly, her throat dry. She felt trapped, every word she spoke seeming to dig her deeper into trouble. "I didn't mean to cause any harm," she said, her voice trembling. "I was just trying to do my job." The first officer exchanged a glance with his colleague before responding. "Your job is to ensure that passengers are treated with respect and dignity. What happened here today was the opposite of that." Sophia sat in stunned silence as the weight of their words settled over her. For the first time, she truly grasped the gravity of her actions, not just for her career but for the harm she had inflicted on the Whitmore family. Her stomach churned as she recalled Marcus's calm, piercing gaze and Elisa's quiet but undeniable strength. She had underestimated them. And now she was facing the fallout. Meanwhile, in the terminal, the Whitmores arrived at baggage claim. Noah, still clutching his toy airplane, watched the conveyor belt with excitement. Marcus and Elise stood quietly, their composed exteriors masking the whirlwind of emotions beneath the surface. "Do you think they'll actually do anything?" Elise asked, her voice low. Marcus glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "They'll have no choice," he replied. "Their reputation is at stake now. If they don't act, this will turn into a much bigger problem for them. The conveyor belt whirred to life, and at that moment Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, scanning the notification. It was a message from his legal team. The incident had already been escalated to the airline's board of directors. A faint smile curled at the corners of his lips as he slipped the phone back into his pocket. "They'll act," he said simply, his tone carrying a quiet certainty. "And if they don't, I'll make sure they regret it." The family gathered their luggage and moved toward the exit, their steps steady and purposeful. Behind them, murmurs filled the air, passengers who had witnessed the incident whispering in hushed tones. Some expressed sympathy. Others voiced outrage. But one thing was clear. The events of this flight would not be forgotten anytime soon. For Marcus, the day wasn't over yet. There was still work to be done. There were meetings to attend, decisions to make, and changes to enforce. As Marcus stepped into the waiting car outside the terminal, he glanced back at the airport one last time. The storm he had set in motion was only just beginning. The drive away from the airport was quiet, but the weight of the day hung heavily in the air. Marcus stared out the window, his fingers drumming lightly against the leather seat. Beside him, Elise sat with a steady presence, her hand resting gently on Noah's lap as the boy dozed off, his toy airplane still clutched tightly in his small hands. The hum of the car engine was the only sound, but Marcus's mind was far from at rest. "We can't let this go," Elise finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but beneath it was an edge of determination. "This wasn't just an insult to us, it's a reflection of something much bigger. If this can happen to us, imagine how often it happens to people without the means to fight back." Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the passing cityscape. "I know," he said quietly. "That's why I've already set the wheels in motion. This isn't just about today, it's about setting a precedent." Elise leaned back, exhaling softly. She trusted Marcus's methodical nature, his ability to turn personal affronts into broader change. But part of her still simmered with anger at the humiliation they had endured. "It wasn't just her," she added, her tone sharpening. "It's the entire system that made her think she could act that way." Marcus turned to her, meeting her gaze. "That's exactly what we're going to address," he said firmly. As the car pulled into their driveway, Noah stirred, rubbing his eyes with a sleepy yawn. Elise scooped him up, holding him close as she carried him inside. Marcus lingered in the car for a moment. Pulling out his phone, he reviewed the latest messages from his legal team. There was already confirmation that the airline's board had been notified of the incident, along with an official statement from their public relations team expressing regret and promising immediate action. But Marcus wasn't interested in hollow words or surface-level damage control. He began composing a quick email, addressing it directly to the airline CEO and copying the board of directors. His tone was measured, but it left no room for negotiation. Marcus's email was professional but unyielding. "The treatment my family and I experienced on Flight 237 today was unacceptable and reflective of deeper issues within your company. This is not about a single employee's behavior, it's about the culture that allowed such behavior to occur. As a primary shareholder, I am requesting a full investigation into this incident and a detailed plan for corrective action. This includes the implementation of mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all employees, the establishment of stronger accountability measures, and a public commitment to ensuring respect and fairness for every passenger. I will expect a formal response within 48 hours outlining your proposed steps. Please understand that this is not a request, it is an expectation." He hit send. Stepping out of the car, Marcus's mind remained fixed on what lay ahead. Inside the house, Elise was tucking Noah into bed. By the time she rejoined Marcus in the living room, she found him seated at his desk, already reviewing documents on his laptop. She sat across from him, watching as he scanned through emails with the same quiet intensity that had carried him through years of negotiations and boardroom battles. "Do you think they'll listen?" she asked. Marcus didn't look up. "They'll have no choice," he replied simply. "This isn't just a PR issue for them, it's a liability. And I intend to make sure they understand that." Meanwhile, back at the airport, Sophia sat alone in a stark conference room. Her nerves were frayed, her thoughts racing. After the initial round of questioning from security, she had been escorted here, to wait. The room was cold, the silence punctuated only by the steady ticking of a clock on the wall. When the door finally opened, 3 individuals entered. A man in a gray suit, a woman with sharp features, a clipboard in hand, and a younger man carrying a laptop. They took their seats across from her, their expressions unreadable, their presence imposing. The woman was the first to speak. "Miss Caldwell," she began, her tone brisk. "We've been tasked with conducting a preliminary review of the incident that occurred on Flight 237. This is not a formal hearing, but we will be documenting your account in detail. Do you understand?" Sophia nodded stiffly, her throat dry. When she opened her mouth to respond, no sound came out. For the first time she truly understood. This wasn't just a bad day at work. This was the beginning of the reckoning. "Yes." The man in the gray suit adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "Let's begin with a basic question. What made you decide to remove Mr. Whitmore and his family from their first-class seats?" Sophia hesitated, her mind scrambling for the right words. I thought there was a mistake," she said weakly. "I thought their tickets might not have been valid." The younger man typed something into his laptop, the rhythmic clatter of the keys echoing through the silent room. The woman with the clipboard raised an eyebrow. "You thought," she repeated. "Based on what, exactly?" Sophia's face flushed. They didn't look like first-class passengers," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The room fell into a heavy silence. The weight of her words lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. The woman with the clipboard exchanged a glance with her colleagues before speaking again. "Miss Caldwell, do you understand how problematic that statement is?" Her voice was measured but firm. "First-class passengers are not defined by appearance." Sophia swallowed hard, her palms slick with sweat. "I realize that now," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake. I was just trying to do my job." The man in the gray suit leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Your job," he said slowly, "is to uphold the airline's policies and ensure a positive experience for all passengers. Today you failed to do that." He paused, letting the words settle before continuing, "in a way that has significant implications. Not just for you but for the entire company." Sophia stared down at her hands, the enormity of her mistake sinking in like a weight pressing on her chest. She had thought she was exercising authority, but instead she had exposed the cracks in her judgment. And now she was facing the consequences. The review team continued their questioning for what felt like hours, dissecting every decision she had made during the flight. By the time the session ended, Sophia felt hollow, like the life had been drained from her. She knew her future with the airline was hanging by a thread, and she wasn't sure how much longer it would hold. As she was escorted out of the room, her gaze flickered toward a large screen displaying news headlines. One caught her eye. Her stomach dropped. "Primary airline shareholder demands reform after discriminatory incident on board." Sophia's heart sank further. It was clear, this was only the beginning of the fallout. The news of the incident spread like wildfire. By the time the Whitmore family arrived home, headlines were already flooding social media and major news outlets. Titles ranged from "Airline in hot water after mistreatment of shareholders' family," "Discrimination on board, family forced to move despite first-class tickets." Each article painted a damning picture of the airline's policies, or lack thereof. Marcus sat in his home office, scrolling through the coverage. The response was overwhelming. Public sentiment leaned heavily in his favor, with social media erupting in outrage. Users flooded comment sections with their own experiences of bias and unfair treatment, many tagging the airline directly, demanding answers and accountability. His phone buzzed nonstop with calls and messages, but he ignored most of them. His focus remained on preparing for his meeting with the airline CEO the following day. In the living room, Elise watched a news segment featuring a panel discussion about the incident. "This isn't just about a family being moved from their seats," one commentator argued. "This is about the systemic biases that persist in customer-facing industries. The fact that this family had to endure such humiliation, despite having valid tickets, highlights a much deeper issue." Elise muted the television, her expression thoughtful. She turned to Noah, who was happily building a tower with his blocks, blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around them. She envied his innocence, but it only strengthened her resolve to protect it. The ordeal had shaken her, but it had also reminded her why they couldn't let this go. Meanwhile, at the airline's headquarters, the executive team was in full crisis mode. Robert Lang, the CEO, stood at the head of a long conference table, his expression grim. Around him, senior executives pored over reports, media coverage and social media analytics. The situation was spiraling out of control, and every passing hour brought more bad press. "This is a disaster," one executive muttered, flipping through a stack of papers. "We've had PR issues before, but this is different." He exhaled sharply. This involves one of our primary shareholders. And they all knew. This was not a storm that would pass easily. If we don't handle this carefully, we could lose him. And worse, our reputation. Robert raised a hand, silencing the room. What's the status on the internal review? He asked, his tone clipped. A senior HR manager cleared her throat. We've completed the preliminary questioning with the flight attendant involved. Her actions were clearly based on bias, though she claims it wasn't intentional. She's been suspended pending further investigation. Robert frowned, his jaw tightening. Suspended? That's not enough. His voice was sharp. We're dealing with a shareholder who has direct access to our board. We need to show decisive action. Another executive spoke cautiously. We're preparing an official apology and outlining new training initiatives. We've already reached out to Mr. Whitmore's team to schedule a meeting. Robert nodded, but his expression remained tense. Good, he said. But it won't be enough to placate him. He's not just angry, he's a man who understands leverage. He's going to push for systemic change. He exhaled, glancing around the room. And we have to be ready to deliver. A heavy silence followed, the weight of his words settling over the room. They all understood, this wasn't just about resolving one incident. This was about addressing the culture that had allowed such an incident to happen in the first place. Back at her apartment, Sophia sat motionless on her couch, staring blankly at the termination notice on her laptop screen. The message from HR had been brief. Cold even. Your actions during Flight 237 were deemed a violation of our company's core values and customer service policies. Your employment with the airline has been terminated, effective immediately. Her hands trembled as she reread the email, the words blurring together. In the span of a single day, her career had unraveled. The job she had prided herself on for years. Gone. And she had no one to blame but herself. Her phone buzzed, lighting up with notifications, texts from friends and family who had seen the news. Most messages were sympathetic. A few, however, were bluntly critical. She didn't respond to any of them. The shame was too heavy. She wasn't ready to face the full extent of her failure. Reaching for the remote, she turned on the television, hoping for a distraction. But the first thing she saw was a news anchor discussing her flight. Her stomach twisted. There was no escaping it. Instead, Sophia was confronted with a news anchor discussing the incident. The airline's handling of this situation has sparked outrage, particularly given the clear racial undertones of the flight attendant's actions. This serves as a stark reminder that unconscious bias can have real, damaging consequences. The words stung. She quickly switched off the TV and buried her face in her hands. She had thought her actions were harmless, that she was just following protocol. But now the truth was glaringly obvious. Her biases had blinded her. And her snap judgment had caused harm, not only to the Whitmores but also to the reputation of the company she had once loved. For the first time, Sophia felt the full weight of what she had done. It wasn't just about losing her job. It was about the damage she had caused to others. After a long moment of hesitation, she picked up her laptop and began typing an email. The recipient, Marcus and Elise Whitmore. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, I am writing to sincerely apologize for my actions on Flight 237. I now realize how my biases influenced my decisions, and I deeply regret the hurt and humiliation I caused your family. My actions were inexcusable and I take full responsibility for them. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She didn't expect forgiveness, but she needed to say it. After finishing the email, she hit send and sat back, staring at the screen. It was a small step, but it was all she could do. As night fell, Marcus sat in his study, reviewing a draft of the airline's proposed plan for reform. It was thorough, outlining mandatory training programs, new accountability measures, and a commitment to fostering a more inclusive culture. It was a step in the right direction. But Marcus knew, words alone wouldn't be enough to create real change. Elise entered the room holding a cup of tea. Is this what you wanted? She asked, gesturing toward the documents on his desk. Marcus looked up, his expression thoughtful. It's a start, he said. But it's not enough. Not yet. He set the papers aside and took the tea from her, his gaze softening. This isn't just about punishing one person. He exhaled, his voice steady. It's about making sure no one else ever has to go through what we did. Elise nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. Then let's make sure they follow through. Marcus smiled faintly, the determination in his eyes unwavering. The fight wasn't over. But neither was his resolve. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the airline's headquarters for his scheduled meeting with Robert Lang, the CEO. The building was sleek and modern, towering over the bustling city streets. As he entered the lobby, a professional-looking assistant greeted him. Her demeanor was respectful, but there was a visible nervousness in her posture. "Mr. Whitmore," she said with a slight bow of her head. "Mr. Lang is expecting you. Right this way." Marcus followed her through the polished corridors, his footsteps measured and deliberate. Employees they passed exchanged furtive glances, aware of who he was and why he was there. When they reached the executive conference room, the assistant opened the door and gestured for him to enter. Robert Lang stood immediately, extending a hand. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for taking the time to meet with us. We deeply regret the circumstances that brought us here." Marcus accepted the handshake, his expression calm but firm. "Let's get straight to it," he replied, taking a seat. "Regret only matters if it's followed by action." Robert nodded, his jaw tightening. "I completely agree. Allow me to walk you through the steps we've already taken." He gestured toward a large screen mounted on the wall, which displayed a detailed presentation. "Our response includes several immediate measures," Robert began. "First, the flight attendant involved has been terminated. We've also launched mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all employees, starting with customer-facing roles. Additionally, we are implementing a stricter accountability framework to address and prevent incidents like this in the future." Marcus listened without interrupting, his eyes scanning the slides on the screen. The proposed changes were comprehensive, but he wasn't ready to accept them at face value. When Robert finished, Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "This is a step in the right direction," he said evenly. "But let's not pretend that firing one person and announcing training programs will fix a systemic issue. This isn't just about one incident," Marcus continued, his voice even but firm. "It's about the culture of your organization. That takes more than policy updates, it takes consistent, measurable change." Robert looked uneasy but nodded. "You're absolutely right. We're committed to ensuring this goes beyond surface-level adjustments." Marcus tapped the table lightly, his tone unwavering. "I want monthly progress reports on the implementation of these changes. I want to see data, employee feedback, incident trends, measurable improvements." He paused, letting his words settle. "And I want an independent review conducted by a third party. Not your internal team." Robert hesitated for a brief moment, then nodded again. "We can arrange that. Anything else?" Marcus's gaze hardened slightly. "Yes. I also want a public apology, not just to my family, but to every passenger who has experienced discrimination while flying with your airline. This isn't just about me. It's about setting a precedent." Robert's expression tightened, but he didn't argue. "Understood. We'll issue a formal statement today." Marcus leaned back, his demeanor calm but commanding. "Good. I'll be watching closely, Mr. Lang. Don't mistake my cooperation for complacency." The tension in the room was thick as Robert nodded once more. "We won't disappoint you," he said quietly. As Marcus stepped out of the headquarters, his phone buzzed with notifications. Social media was still buzzing with discussions about the incident. Hashtags like #airline accountability and #bias in flight were trending globally. Marcus scrolled through the posts briefly, noting the widespread support, but also the growing demand for real systemic change. This wasn't just about his family anymore. It had become a flashpoint for a much larger conversation. Back at home, Elise sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open. She was reading an email from the airline's PR team. The message outlined their planned public statement, an apology and a commitment to addressing the issues raised by the incident. She forwarded it to Marcus with a simple note. "What do you think?" As Marcus stepped inside, setting his bag down, he glanced at his phone and read the email. His reply was a single word. "Adequate." Elise looked up as he entered the kitchen, her expression expectant. Elise gave Marcus a knowing smile. "Adequate," she teased lightly. "That's high praise coming from you." Marcus chuckled, leaning against the counter. "It's a start," he said. "But there's still a long way to go." Elise nodded, her expression turning thoughtful. "Do you think they'll follow through? Or is this just damage control?" Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "If they don't," he said, his voice calm but resolute, "I'll make sure they wish they had." At the airline, the ripple effects of the incident were already being felt. Employees gathered in break rooms and hallways, whispering about the changes that were coming. Some were relieved, welcoming the focus on bias and accountability. Others were skeptical, doubting that a company so large could change its culture so quickly. Meanwhile, Sophia was nowhere to be seen. Her termination had become the subject of quiet conversations among her former colleagues. Many were shocked at how quickly the situation had escalated. But for those who had witnessed her actions firsthand, the consensus was clear. She had crossed a line. And the consequences were unavoidable. Grace, who had worked closely with Sophia on the flight, reflected on the ordeal as she prepared for her shift. She had always known that the airline's culture had its flaws. But seeing them so blatantly exposed had been a wake-up call. She vowed to approach her own work differently, ensuring that no passenger ever felt the way the Whitmores had been made to feel. That evening, as Marcus and Elise prepared for bed, a small voice interrupted them. Noah peeked into their room, his toy airplane clutched tightly in his hand. "Mommy? Daddy?" he asked, his voice small. "Are people still mad about what happened on the plane?" Marcus knelt down, pulling Noah into a gentle hug. "Some people are upset, buddy," he said softly. "But it's because they want things to get better. And we're helping them do that." Noah nodded, his eyes wide. "Are you going to fix it?" Marcus smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "That's the plan." As Noah padded back to his room, Elise turned to Marcus, her expression a mix of pride and determination. "We are going to fix it," she said quietly. "Not just for us. For everyone." Marcus nodded, his resolve unwavering. "This isn't the end," he replied. "It was just the beginning." The following morning, news outlets buzzed with coverage of the airline's public statement, which had gone live overnight. The apology was thorough and direct, acknowledging the incident involving the Whitmore family and outlining immediate steps being taken to address broader systemic issues. The statement read in part, "We deeply regret the incident that occurred on Flight 237 involving Mr. Whitmore and his family. This event does not reflect our values, and we are committed to taking meaningful action to prevent such situations in the future. Effective immediately, we are implementing mandatory training programs, strengthening our policies, and conducting a third-party review of our organizational practices to ensure equity and respect for all passengers." The statement concluded with a direct apology to the Whitmore family, recognizing Marcus's role as a shareholder and, more importantly, as a valued customer who deserved better. Social media exploded with reactions. While some commended the airline for owning up to its mistakes, others remained skeptical, accusing the company of mere damage control. The hashtags #AccountabilityMatters and #FlyFair continued to trend, fueling debates about systemic biases in customer service industries. Marcus read the statement while sitting at the breakfast table, his expression thoughtful. Across from him, Elise watched closely, sipping her coffee. "Well?" she asked. "It's a solid first step," Marcus said, setting his phone down. "But now they'll have to prove they mean it." Elise nodded, her expression serious. "And what about Sophia? Do you think she learned anything from all of this?" Marcus paused, considering the question. "That's not up to me," he said finally. "But I hope she did. People like her are part of the problem. But if they're willing to change, they can also be part of the solution." Meanwhile, in her small apartment, Sophia sat hunched over her laptop, scrolling through the same news coverage. The airline's public apology had done little to ease her growing sense of guilt. If anything, it deepened it. Every headline, every comment about the incident felt like a personal indictment. And for the first time, she had no way to justify her actions. Sophia opened her email inbox, rereading the message she had sent to the Whitmore family the night before. There had been no response yet. But she hadn't expected one. She wasn't sure she deserved forgiveness. But sending the apology had felt necessary. A small step toward taking responsibility. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Grace. "Grace, I heard about your termination. I hope you're doing okay. This whole thing has been a mess, but maybe it's a chance to start fresh." Sophia stared at the message for a long moment before typing a reply. "Sophia, thanks Grace. I'm trying. I have a lot to think about." Grace's response came quickly. "Grace, if you ever want to talk, let me know. We've all made mistakes. It's how we learn from them that matters." Sophia set the phone down, her mind racing. Grace's words stuck with her. It's how we learn from them that matters. She wasn't sure what her next step would be. But she knew one thing. She couldn't go back to who she had been before. Change had to start somewhere. And it had to start with her. At the airline's headquarters, Robert Lang stood before the board of directors, presenting the company's plan for reform. Marcus sat at the end of the long table, silent but commanding. The tension in the room was palpable as Robert outlined the sweeping changes being implemented. From new training programs to independent reviews designed to prevent incidents like this from ever happening again. When Robert finished, he turned to Marcus. "Mr. Whitmore, we're confident that these measures will address the issues you've raised. We value your feedback and your commitment to holding us accountable." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "This is a good start," he said. "But that's all it is, a start. I'll be watching closely to ensure these changes are more than just promises on paper." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared to argue. His influence was undeniable, and his resolve left no room for doubt. As the meeting adjourned, a board member approached Marcus. She was an older woman, her expression kind but serious. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I want you to know that some of us on the board are fully behind you. This kind of accountability," she hesitated, then met his gaze, "is long overdue. Needed for a long time." Marcus nodded, offering a small smile. "I appreciate that," he said. "Now let's make sure it happens." Later that day, as Marcus returned home, he found Elise in the backyard watching Noah play with his toy airplane. The boy ran around, laughing as he mimicked the sound of an engine, his arms outstretched like wings. Marcus stepped beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "The meeting went well," he said simply. Elise smiled. "I'm glad. Did you give them the usual no excuses talk?" Marcus chuckled. "Something like that." They watched Noah for a moment in comfortable silence. Finally, Elise spoke, her voice soft. "Do you think we'll ever stop having to fight these battles?" Marcus sighed, his expression thoughtful. "Probably not," he admitted. "But every fight brings us closer to something better. And as long as we keep pushing, change is inevitable." Elise leaned her head against his shoulder. "Well, if anyone can make it happen, it's you." Marcus smiled, his gaze steady. "It's us," he corrected. "We're in this together." As Noah's laughter filled the air, the weight of the past few days began to lift. The journey wasn't over, but they were ready for whatever came next. The ripple effects of the incident on Flight 237 continued to spread. Conversations about bias and accountability extended far beyond just one airline. News outlets reported on the company's reforms, hailing it as a turning point for how corporations addressed systemic discrimination. Other airlines, facing public scrutiny, announced similar reviews of their policies. Spurred by the pressure and the undeniable influence of Marcus Whitmore's actions, the Whitmore family's story became more than just a headline. It became a catalyst for change. Advocacy groups used the incident as a rallying cry, demanding better training, stricter policies, and real consequences across customer service industries. Social media platforms buzzed with stories from passengers who had faced similar discrimination, their voices amplified by the spotlight on the airline's response. At home, Marcus and Elise watched the developments with cautious optimism. It was never about the attention. It was never about the accolades. It was about seeing real change take root. Their fight had never been just about them. And now it never would be. It had never been about revenge. It had always been about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what they had. One afternoon, Marcus received an email from the airline CEO. The subject line was simple: Progress Report. Inside, the message detailed the initial results of the reforms. Mandatory training programs had been launched, with over 80% of employees completing the first phase. A third-party review had begun, and initial findings highlighted areas for further improvement. But the company was actively working to address systemic issues beyond just this incident. At the bottom of the email, there was a personal note from Robert Lang. "Thank you for holding us accountable. Your insistence on doing what's right has made our company better. And we're not done yet." Marcus forwarded the email to Elise, adding his own note. Step 1 complete. On to Step 2. Elsewhere, Sophia sat in a small coffee shop, scrolling through job listings on her laptop. It had been a week since her termination, and she had spent every moment reflecting on what had happened. The regret was still raw, but she was determined not to let it define her. She had started attending workshops on unconscious bias and diversity, hoping to better understand where she had gone wrong, and how she could do better. As she sipped her coffee, her phone buzzed. A new email notification. She nearly dropped her cup when she saw the sender. The Whitmore family. She hadn't expected a response. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. "Miss Caldwell, thank you for your apology. While we cannot undo what happened, we appreciate your acknowledgement of the harm caused. Growth begins with accountability, and we hope you continue to pursue it." Sophia stared at the email, a lump forming in her throat. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step. She closed her laptop, her resolve strengthening. She couldn't change the past, but she could build a better future. One decision at a time. A month later, Marcus found himself on another flight with his family. This time the atmosphere was different. The staff greeted them warmly, but without hesitation. Their professionalism was unwavering. As they settled into their seats in first class, Elise looked at Marcus with a small smile. "Do you think they know who you are?" she asked playfully. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter if they do. What matters," Marcus said, glancing around the cabin, "is that they're treating everyone the way they should." As the plane taxied down the runway, Noah leaned over, holding up his toy airplane. "We're flying again, Daddy," he exclaimed, his face lighting up with excitement. Marcus smiled. "Yes, we are." He glanced at Elise, her calm, radiant presence grounding him as always. This was what it was all for. Not power, not recognition, but the simple dignity of being treated fairly. As the plane lifted into the sky, Marcus leaned back in his seat, watching the clouds drift past the window. He knew the work wasn't finished. There would always be more to fight for, more to improve. But for now he allowed himself a moment of peace, because the journey they had started was already making a difference, and sometimes that was enough.